Since I saw this awesome trailer for The Last of Us 2, I decided to make a character from that world. And after that, the HBO's live action series came, which really added fuel to the fire. So I decided to start a project and I went looking for a concept on ArtStation. I knew I was not going to make any of the main characters like Joel or Ellie because they were already being recreated many times in 3D. So I came across this great concept by a character concept artist at Naughty Dogs. It's a concept for a character named Jesse from The Last of Us 2. I really like this character because of simple design and survivalist kind of vibe. So I picked up this concept and started working. So before starting, let's quickly go through the overall game character workflow for easy understanding. Gathering references. In this step, we look for a concept which we will be creating in 3D and some real life references things which are present in our concept. High poly sculpting. In this step, we sculpt the high poly in Zbrush or Blender or any other software of choice to create forms and shape. Game res or low poly mesh. In this step, we create a low poly mesh which is optimized for game engine. We consider many things like poly count, loops, UVs, etc. in this process. UV unwrapping. In this step, we unwrap the whole character and lays out its UVs in 0 to 1 space. Preparing the mesh for bakes and baking men. So this step is very important as well as a little bit technical. Why? That we will discuss later in the video. Grooming. This step consists of creating hair for the character, which we can do by hair cards or XGen Hairs. We will be using XGen Hairs for this character. Texturing. In this step, we create textures and set up materials for our character. Final presentation. This step is the final one where we create a final image for our project. Let's start with gathering references. We all know how important references are while creating anything in 3D. So this was my mood board at the end of the project. As you can see, I have made several boards for different parts of the concept. After searching for a while, I came to know that Jesse was played by a real character. So I corrected few of his face references from different angles for matching his likeness. Since this character is from The Last of Us, I found few of the original artworks uploaded by the Naughty Dog studios and kept it as a benchmark for the quality and presentation. These are few RBX images which are useful while creating the base color map for the skin. After I added few references for the jacket, jeans and backpack and few for the hand sculpting, and we were ready to sculpt the high poly. Before I start sculpting anything, I always try to keep one thing in mind, and that is the scale of an object, and in our case it's the body. The scale is so important because it affects many things down the road like subsurface scattering, cloth simulations, and XGen hairs, etc. They might not work as intended if the scale is off. So to set up the scale, I always start with Maya. Keep one thing in mind, go to Windows, Setting and Preferences, and change the working units to centimeters. To fix the scale of our base mesh, go to Create, Measuring Tool and Distance Measuring Tool. Here, by keeping the grid snapping on and holding X, we create these two locators in one line and press Enter. Then by grabbing one locator, we will drag and keep the distance between these two locators around 180 centimeters. 180 centimeters in real life is around 5 feet 9 inches tall. So then we can scale our base mesh according to this height like this, and then we can delete the history and export this mesh and start sculpting. So for this project, my main motive was to utilize Unreal Engine 5 as much as I can. So I went ahead and picked up the base mesh for body and eyes from the MetaHuman. For eyes, it's important to use the base mesh because we can take advantages of Unreal Eye material. Since this was my second human character, I wanted to try to sculpt different ethnicity. That's also one of the reasons I chose this concept. For matching the likeness little bit better, I tried to do camera match in Zbrush. just to get some ideas on face proportions and features. One of the main feature in Chinese people is their eye. They have little bit of overlap on their upper eyelid, which I am trying to sculpt here. Whenever I am sculpting any likenesses, I try to sculpt basic eyebrows and hair early in the process. It helps a lot while sculpting the face. Painting the eyeballs early also helps us position the eyeballs correct and make the face look natural. So now the face was in decent shape, I started working on hands. As you can see, I have sliced the hand from above the wrist because it will be covered with the jacket, and inside of the body will not be visible, so we don't need to sculpt that. While sculpting difficult parts like hand, I tried to divide them in primary, secondary and tertiary form, which helps in simplifying the sculpt. After I was done with hands, I came back on the face, but this time for breaking the symmetry. While sculpting human face, it's really important to break the symmetry in the end, otherwise the face will not look organic. I always try to work on layers while breaking the symmetry for comparing in the end. So as you have seen in the concept, the face is not in the close-up. So I took a little bit of creative liberty and added a big wound on his face to show a little bit of his backstory. Since he is from the world of Last of Us, it's impossible to live without a wound. Okay, so now that we are done with the face and hands, let's start working on the clothes. For this project, I chose to create basic cloths in Marvelous Design and then sculpt over them in Zbrush to refine the shape. I don't try to get the final result in Marvelous Designer because I'm still learning it. I try to get something basic to start with. As I said before, scale of an object is very important while sculpting cloth. I always try to get as many references from the internet about the blueprint of clothes, where the seam will be in the real life, etc. As you can see, the jeans is looking more like a trouser, but that's okay, because we will be sculpting over it. Once I am happy with the basic shape, I export these meshes as OBJ and start sculpting. While sculpting, I mainly focus on the property of cloth, which is defined by its wrinkles, weight, etc. I also try to keep in mind the next step of the process, which is a retopology. So I Z-remesh these meshes and try to extract that topology and use it later so I don't have to start from the scratch. In between sculpting these big parts, I also start working on bags, shoes and belts. Since I am from VFX background, we use a lot of photogrammetry data. So I thought of using that in my project by 3D scanning my shoe and putting it in the character. After I am done with the high poly, I decimate these meshes. I export two meshes, one the decimated high poly and second with the Z-remesh topology and the lower subdivision for extracting and cleaning the topology in Maya. For creating the low poly game mesh, I use Autodesk Maya. It can be done in any software. The main motive of this step is to create an optimized mesh which can be properly rigged, animated and deformed. For reusing the Z-remesh topology, I try to focus on loops. Those loops which are perfect, I keep them and remove any spiral loop or extra loop. I use Quadro tool with keeping the sculpt live. This way all my topology gets perfectly snapped to the sculpt. While doing retopology, I try to record any detail which is affecting the silhouette of the mesh in topology and try to bake any detail which is kind of on the surface, which doesn't affect the silhouette that much. I also keep loops where I will be making seams in the UV style, like little cloth overlaps, etc. I also try to reuse part of meshes which can be UV'd and textured once and then can be flipped like shoes, hands, etc. This can be done to only less important objects, not the main parts. Once I am done with the low poly, I quickly go through whole mesh and make sure there is no n-gons, visible overlaps, non-manifold geometries, etc. to keep the mesh technically perfect for the UVs. While doing UVs, I keep few points in my mind, like how many texture sets are required for this character. Do I need to lay out UVs in certain ways for texture pattern to flow correctly? What are the objects which I can UV once and then transfer those UVs to similar objects? Where to put UV seams? What are the items which I can squeeze down to get more texture space for other objects, like example, back face of the objects or bottom of the shoes, etc. I start with a camera based UVs and then creating manual seam and then doing the unfold. In terms of laying out UVs, I divide them based on the texture set. Like for this character, I kept face, backpack, jacket, shoes, etc. After I'm done with the high poly, low poly and UVs, now I will be preparing these meshes for perfect bakes. This step is really important because if not done perfectly, it might give errors while baking or it might not bake at all. Okay, so first thing I do is delete anything which is not going to be baked, like eyes, inner mouths, basic hair, etc. for both high poly and low poly meshes. Secondly, I start renaming the meshes and add underscore low suffix to all the low poly meshes and underscore high suffix to all the high poly meshes. The baker, in our case marmoset toolbags, works on the basis of geometry name. If the names does not match, it will not bake the map. Third, I make different groups based on texture sets in Maya and in Zbrush for easy export. For keeping the name same in low poly and high poly, I just copy them from Maya and paste them in Zbrush. Fourth, I assign different blend materials to all the texture sets and also name them properly. This way we can get different texture sets in Substance Painter, which comes very handy while texturing. Fifth, in ZBrush I apply different poly paint to all the different objects with the same property, like all materials are red, all skin parts are skin color, etc. This helps us to create an ID map based on which we can separate our materials in Substance Painter. Sixth, now it's just a matter of exporting meshes according to texture sets in different files, not as one big FBX because it might be heavy for the baker. For baking maps, I use marmoset toolbag because I think it's simple to use and it bakes good map. So after exporting low and high poly as different FBXs according to texture set, I head over to marmoset. Here I start by creating a new bake project based on different parts, like in this case jacket, and then I load the low and high poly meshes. I create different bake projects because it's a little easier for me to understand. If you have named the geometries correctly, you can toggle the high and low poly geos by creating H and L button. Now we can change some settings, like we can keep the format to 16-bit channel to get rid of any small unwanted artifact. I'm keeping the resolution to 2K right now. And now by clicking configure, we can check what map we need. Here I will select normal, curvature, AO and vertex color. After giving the output path, we can click on the bake to start baking. And our bake for jacket is done. It will automatically create a preview material and apply on the low poly. You can preview maps by clicking on the button beside the magnifying glass in front of the map's name. After repeating the same process for the rest of the meshes and creating different bake projects, here is the final bake for the body. I am keeping the face on the different file for performance reasons. You can turn on wireframe by going to gear button on the right top menu. Now after baking the face maps with the same process, we head over to grooming. For this project I did the grooming in XGen. Now since it's a game character, grooming can be done by two methods, hair cards or interactive XGen hairs. I chose XGen because I have more working experience with it and I'm still learning how to set up the hair cards. For my next project, I am planning to do hair card. One thing which is very important while using XGen is to first set up the project in Maya, because XGen creates many maps and saves them in directory. It's really important to set up the project, otherwise XGen can break. I always start with simple things like eyebrows and eyelash, because once those are done, the character starts to feel alive and it helps in creating the main head hairs. Now in between you will see an already completed groom on the character. That groom is from another meta-human that I borrowed for keeping as a reference. That groom was matching pretty close to my final groom, so I thought it might be helpful to keep it as a reference in the scene. XGen is quite powerful because of its modifiers and its ability to work non-destructively. We can easily add variation, clump, noises to the hairs by using the modifiers. The main part of grooming process is setting up guides. It is the most time-consuming part of the grooming process, but if it's done correctly, it can create pretty good results.
The use of region maps was also heavy in this kind of hairstyle because it splits in between. To create few thin clumps which are on the face, I create a different description for more control and easier understanding. So after working a little while, this is the final groom. You can see I have added few flyaways hairs, few thin clumps in front and a little stubble. I recommend creating different descriptions for separate parts. And here's a quick breakdown of modifiers on the head groom. Now we can export all these descriptions as interactive groom for Unreal Engine 5 by going to Generate, Convert to Interactive Groom and hit Convert. Now we can hide our main groom and select all the interactive grooms and export them by going to Generate, Cache, Export Cache and selecting the current frame and export. Every step from now on is not linear. That means it involves a lot of research and jumping back and forth between softwares. That's why I haven't created time-lapse for these steps, but I will try my best to break it down. Texturing a whole character is also new to me, but that's a step where the whole character starts to come together. I start texturing with face because that's the main focal point of a character. It tells the story of the character, so I try to spend most time on the face. I follow the main philosophy as the modeling, that is focusing on primary, secondary and tertiary details. Here we have our face with normal map applied. In the beginning, I keep the roughness to 0 to focus only on the base color. Then I choose a simple base color for the skin. The main thing that makes the texture organic is the variation. So I try to add as much as variation as I can by adding the color variation, moles, freckles, veins, etc. I try to keep it very heavy-handed in the beginning, then merge it later in the process. I found this great acne material on internet, which really added some height variation on the skin. I controlled it by applying black mask and painting only where I needed those acnes, for example on cheeks and chin. Then I added a little bit of dirt on his face to show a little bit of his survival story. Now it was time to add a lot of blood on his wound, so I made a simple blood red material and painted it where I needed the blood to be visible. I also added few drops of blood leaking from the wound. It was also important to add a little bit of redness around the wound to show that it is starting to get infected. After that, I added few old stain of blood that might be from an old injury on his face. Now he was starting to look more like from an apocalypse world. So I started working on the roughness. I controlled the roughness with the curvature map so the pores can be little bit rougher than the main skin. Then I added a cloud 3 texture to add bigger breakups and add roughness variation. Then to break the surface even more, I added a small black and white spots texture over the noise, which gave even finer breakups to the roughness. Then I manually painted the roughness on the places like lips and below eyes, and at last I made a layer for sweat on his forehead and mustache area. Then I followed the same workflow for all the other parts of the character. Then I exported the texture to apply in Unreal. This step involves a lot of jumping between texturing software and game engine to check if everything is working fine or not. After all that, I was ready to take this character to Unreal Engine 5. So I wanted to render this character in Unreal Engine 5 because I wanted to learn it. And I think the project-based learning is the best way to learn anything. I also wanted to give strand-based hairs a try because in marmoset toolbag, they become a little bit heavy to handle. To start with, I create a project in Unreal. I select the game preset, then the blank format, and I keep the ray tracing off and create a project. Then I create a new level and import my main post game res mesh and XGen Hairs. For posing the character, I simply use the transpose master in Zbrush. The lighting setup that you are seeing here is the preset for the MetaHuman that you can find on Unreal Engine Marketplace for free. I used this studio setup because it was a bit neutral, which is perfect for doing look dev of a character because it will not affect the colors. I also turn on few plugins which are Movie Render Queue, Alembic Groom Importer and Groom. This is important to import our XGen Hairs. The main difficulty that I faced in Unreal was setting up the material, for which I saw this great tutorial by JHILL on YouTube, which really helped me clear out my fundamentals about Unreal materials. Then I imported my textures from Substance into Unreal and made a master material. Here is the final node tree which I created for my material. On the textures, I also added a micro normal for adding more finer details onto the fabric. Then for the lighting, I removed the studio setup and added a 3-point lighting setup with the area light. I kept the color of these area lights on the warmer side to match with the feeling of my backplate that I was going to use. I was going to render a PNG from Unreal and composite it in Photoshop, so I rendered the final image as PNG with some depth of field and sent it to Photoshop. Here I added the backdrop and few effects like smoke in the back and some flying particles. Then I adjusted the brightness a little bit and here is our final image. Then for the final post on ArtStation, I rendered out few more shots from different angles. With this project, my main motive was to learn new things like Unreal Engine 5 and follow the full game pipeline and share that journey with all the great artists out there. Still, there is a lot of room for improvement, so let's learn and grow together. And I will see you in our next adventure.